Morning, everybody. We'll get started in just a couple minutes here. I guess afternoon. For anybody out in the audience, feel free to come on up to the table. There's plenty of seats. Okay, everybody. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. A few bit of housekeeping items before we get going. In case anybody needs to use the restroom, they're out the back door there behind everybody. Off to the left, there's water fountain out that way too. In case of emergency, earthquake or what have you, you can duck and cover under your seats if you need to, or we have evacuation areas that you can follow staff. We'll direct you out there in case something like that happens. I think it goes without saying we're expecting, if there's discussion that will happen as part of this, so that we're all professionals. We expect to have cordial and productive discussion. I think that goes without saying. I think that's all the housekeeping we need to get through for now. So my name is Ian McMillan. I'm a planning and rules manager here at the district. We're here for a working group on facility-based mobile source measures. Right now, we have a conference call-in line that's available to folks, as well as a webcast. And then obviously everybody here in the room. So if we hear little voices on the phone, we know that that's where it's coming from. I will ask everybody that's on the phone if you can mute your line unless you actually have a question. We want to make sure that we don't have any distractions as we're going through in case somebody's on hold. Also, please do not place us on hold. We will hear your music. But if you have questions, feel free to speak up. I think we might as well go through introductions, and we'll just kind of work our way around, I guess, off to my left. So go ahead and start, Dan.
Dan Garcia, South Coast AQMD staff.
Priscilla Hamilton, AQMD staff.
Mike Laybourne, AQMD staff.
Thomas Yelenich, PMSA. Eric Liu, Ramble Environ.
Sarah Wiltfong, Los Angeles County Business Federation.
Drew Delaney, Associates Environmental.
David Pettit, NRDC.
Brian Hickson, Highland Fairview.
Steve Smith, San Bernardino County Transportation Authority.
Gail Shiomoto Lore, representing the City of Mission Viejo.
David Rothbart, Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts.
Bill Lamar, Executive Director of the California Small Business Alliance.
Sarah Sheehy, Hollywood Burbank Airport.
Maggie Martinez, Hollywood Burbank Airport.
Mark Hardiman, Hollywood Burbank Airport.
Lou Bronstein, John Wayne Airport.
Sarah Johnson, California Airports Council.
Robert Freeman, Los Angeles World Airports.
Tammy McCrossan, Los Angeles World Airports.
Philip Fine, Deputy Executive Officer, AQMD, and we're kind of sandwiched in this corner, so these seats are available if anyone wants to come up and sit up here.
Barbara Baird, AQMD Legal Office.
Vera Tiagi, AQMD Legal Office.
Brian Tomasovic, AQMD Legal Office.
And we'll go ahead and ask for folks in the back. We might as well just go through. There's not that many of us. For the folks on the phone or on the webcast, you won't be able to hear everybody here, but if there's questions that come up later from people in the audience, we'll have them speak into a microphone. But let's start over here in the front left corner. We'll go ahead and ask for folks in the back. We might as well just go through. There's not that many of us. For the folks on the phone or on the webcast, you won't be able to hear everybody here, but if there's questions that come up later from people in the audience, we'll have them speak into a microphone. Let's start over here in the front left corner. Great. Okay. Thank you, everybody. So we'll go ahead and get started. We do have a presentation here. It's sort of split up into two parts. We have a space about halfway through for a little break. I think if you have questions along the way, let's go ahead and feel free to stop us, and if you want to have a discussion on a point, we can do that. We might push through on some parts to have longer conversations at a break time, but feel free to stop at any time or ask me to stop at any time. Okay, thank you, everybody. So we'll go ahead and get started. So here on, I should say for folks that are watching the webcast, we also have the ability, if you don't have the audio call-in line, you can also just email us a question at fbmsm@aqmd.gov. That's facility-based mobile source measures at aqmd.gov. So the agenda that was sent out already, I don't think I'm going to need to go through that again. I did want to just mention briefly, we did receive some comments from our previous working group meetings from 8 entities. Obviously, we've had more conversations than just these few written comments. The general theme of these comments has followed very similar discussions that have happened throughout the air quality management plan process and the beginning stages of these facility-based measures. On one side, we've heard some very clear discussion that encouraging us to do voluntary measures and encouraging us to pursue some flexible voluntary programs. On the flip side, we've also heard that a regulatory approach would be better. So we've heard sort of both sides of this point, that wanting to make sure that there's enforceable mechanisms that are in place as we move forward. We do know certainly incentive funding is absolutely critical, right? It's something that's been talked about a lot. That is a little bit separate process from what this working group is doing. We expect that there will be, that working group should be starting up, we believe, sometime in August. There should be some noticing going out on that relatively soon. I don't think that has been announced yet, but there will be a separate working group, although we know there's going to be a lot of crossover, and some of the discussion from that working group will come into this one and vice versa. There's been also, or some of the comments were asking us to take a look at existing programs and recognize some of the good work that's happened already. And part of that is what we're going to be going through in this presentation today. Of course, we need to balance economic and environmental factors. That's really key to all of this. It has to be, whatever solutions are come up with, they have to be workable solutions. One of the things that we heard too was talking about the metrics. We've talked about this in some of the previous meetings. What are the metrics we should use as we move forward on this process? One of the ones we've heard quite often is about cost effectiveness, and we are building cost effectiveness into everything that we're going to be doing on this, and I'll show you how we're thinking about doing that as we work through this presentation today. And in addition, emissions and health risk. How do we tie that into what we're doing on these metrics? And so we'll be doing that as well. We've had we've had some questions about emission reduction goals and the timing, and how we're going to set that process up, and we'll again walk through that in this presentation somewhat. And then of course asking that local land use authority be maintained, and check. Yes, we plan to not pursue any land use authority. That's not what we're trying to do at all. It's part of this process. That is the purview of cities and counties. This is a different kind of process. Quick question?
Are the comments available online?
The question was, are the comment letters available online? We have not put them online yet. I guess if there's a request that we do that, we could consider that, but they aren't online currently. So we can take a look at that. Yeah, typically when we go through, for example, a rulemaking process, all the comment letters are placed online so everybody can look at them. This is not technically a rulemaking process that we're going through, but it's something that we can consider as we move forward. Okay. So one of the things I wanted to do was to walk through some of the website materials that we've developed. We sent out an email last night letting folks know that the facility-based measures website has gone up and has a lot more information on it, although it's certainly going to be a work in progress. There's a lot of work still to do on it, but I just wanted to do a very quick walkthrough of what is on that website right now. And a lot of this is getting to this framework concept that we introduced at the last meeting, how we're planning to present this framework, and it's mainly going to be a web tool, and so I want to walk through that there. So on the AQMD webpage, we've sent out the links on the email, but if you forget the link, it's on the AQMD webpage, and it's actually under the AQMP page. So you go to the Clean Air Plan, Air Quality Management Plan, and then you scroll all the way down to facility-based measures. This is completely non-intuitive, apologize for that, but here you are. And so at this point, we now have the 5 facility-based measures that were included in the AQMP are actually buttons up here on the top of the page. So for example, you see the warehouse distribution centers on the left and working their way across. We have general information up here as far as this meeting, the staff presentation, which we're going over today, the various relevant information in here. Old meetings and old presentations are linked on here, a little bit of a write-up, contact information with the frequently asked questions. Getting to the framework itself, if we go into one of the facility-based measures, for example, on warehouses, we see again that there's specifics here about the upcoming meetings. But then as we get towards the bottom of the page, we have a series of links here. And these were the columns that were going across on the framework that we had discussed before. And so, for example, if we click on the regulations link, we've started to populate this page already with You see there's a little bit of a matrix up top here for each individual source type, for example, on trucks and buses, construction equipment, light duty vehicles, etc. And then working across, we have federal regulations, state regulations, and future state commitments. You can click on these and it just takes you to a different part of this page. And you see that we have links here, a very, very short summary, and then a link to what each of these regulations are. We plan to continue to build this. I think some of the next steps that we're going to be working on, especially on this website, is to how to take the next step with this. So all these regulations are already in place. Well, what can we take out of the regulations to show us what are the opportunities to get further emission reductions? And so I think what we'll be doing is building, say, for example, a little bit to the right of this page, maybe other columns to say what is the takeaway as far as what are the requirements, what are the timing, and what's the space that's available to get some more emission reductions that will be above and beyond these regulations. So we'll be continuing to build that as we go through this process, but we wanted to show that this information is up right now. As I go back a page, we see that we also have linked, oops, I'm sorry, let me get back to, we go inside the facilities page. Right now we have these emission reduction opportunities. We plan to be spending a lot of our time over the next 6 months really on this bit of the emission reduction opportunities. It takes you right now to more information coming soon, and we'll be getting there. But this is where we think a lot of the meat is going to be coming from as we go through this process. But the structure is built here now. We'll be continuing to update this. I think for now that's probably enough on the website, but we encourage you to explore this and take a look at it. And we'll be sending updates and letting folks know that this is updated through time. Okay. So here on slide 6, we want to start to talk a little bit more about the SIP crediting process. And this is a little bit different than what we traditionally do for traditional rulemaking. And so we wanted to walk through a little bit of how this process, how we see this process working. And so we wanted to start a little bit at the basics and kind of get a little bit more advanced as we go through. So here on slide 6, this just shows the emissions inventory, the NOx emissions inventory that was included in the Air Quality Management Plan. And it's showing for the base year of 2012, and you see that's over on the left, and then the baseline years of 2023 and 2031 rather. And the color coding on this chart reflects the different emission sources. So all the greens are on-road sources. The blues are very broad off-road, and that it's off-road equipment, aircraft, and locomotives. The purples are waterborne sources. The maroon color there at the bottom or towards the bottom is residential fuel combustion, and then the grays are stationary sources. So everything that's sort of colored here is more or less fair game when it comes to facility-based measures, and that there is some sort of emissions that applies to facility-based measures. What we also see for 2023 and 2031, we have the carrying capacities shown on this graph, and this would be the NOx level that is that we need to get down to meet the attainment standards for, in particular, for ozone. And so these carrying, pardon me, these carrying capacities were the same that's shown in the AQMP. What this next slide is showing, slide 7, it's taking that same graph from the previous and sort of expanding it a little bit. And so if we look at 2023 and 2031, the colored graphs there, the green, blue, purple, etc., that is the same as the previous slide. About what's shown right next to it is the control strategy. So again, we have the carrying capacities there, those blue horizontal lines on the bottom. So in 2023, it's 141 tons. That's what we need to get down to. In 2031, it's 96 tons. And what we see above that is sort of the building blocks of the control strategy. So for example, if we look in 2023, we see right above the carrying capacity, we see a 7 there. So 7 tons is the commitment from AQMD on stationary sources. And that's a bit of a defined strategy. Those rules are not in place yet, but we've defined where we think those emission reductions are going to come from. We keep moving up, we get to 16 tons. That's AQMD's mobile source strategy, and that's the defined part of the strategy. So that's mostly through incentives and existing incentive programs like Carl Moyer, et cetera, where AQMD has made commitments based on those existing defined programs. Moving up from there, we get into CARB's strategy. So there you see a 5, and that would be CARB's, similarly, their incentive programs and what they have defined when it comes to mobile sources. And then we get to that top part of 108. That's 108 tons from CARB's state strategy, and that's further deployment measures. And those further deployment measures are not very well defined just yet as far as where those emission reductions are going to come from. There's been some discussion in CARB's strategy on the different approaches to try to get that. Obviously, incentives are really crucial and critical on this, and we're certainly pursuing that. But there's other things that can be done. Efficiency improvements. There's different ways to get more bang for your buck if you're operating equipment. Advanced technology penetration. Are there different ways to try to get at that? And then local measures. So the CARB commitment, when it comes to the control strategy, a total of 113 tons in 2023, and then 111 tons in 2031. And so that is CARB is committed to that level. What we as AQMD has said is we will also try to help them get those emission reductions. So for example, on the further deployment measures of 108 tons, in addition, we are going to be pursuing our own efforts. So that includes incentives, that includes facility-based measures, includes maybe an expansion of fleet rule authority. And so that's sort of layered right in there with the 108 tons. So there's a state commitment, but there's also an AQMD commitment to help try to get those emission reductions. And the same thing in 2031. Okay, we'll keep going. So here on slide 8, thinking about SIP credit, there's a number of things that we need to do to try to get SIP credit, and there's a number of goals that are out there that we need to be aware of. So obviously we know we have our attainment dates. So we have a 1-hour standard, we have an 8-hour, multiple 8-hour standards we need to try to get to. We have 24-hour and annual PM 2.5 standards. So those all have their own timelines associated with them. In addition to those timelines, and I'll walk through those in just a little bit, we have pre-attainment requirements. There are things we need to do before we get to attainment. So for example, when it comes to ozone, there's a process called reasonable further progress. And I don't need to go into the details here. If you're really interested, you can go into the AQMP Appendix 6C. But what this essentially says is that we need to show that we're getting a 3% emission reduction every year from the baseline as we get towards attainment. So 3% every year when it comes to ozone. But importantly, the reasonable further progress, this is a backwards looking. This is what has been achieved already, right? Or what is already defined and what is already achieved through existing regulation or through existing emission reductions that have already occurred. That's a little bit different than this next bullet point here on the further deployment measures. So these further deployment measures, what we've said in the AQMP is that we have in many ways defined what we think we need to do for these further deployment measures. We have some technologies that we think can actually get us there. But at the same time, because of Clean Air Act requirements, we think there is some 182E5 flexibility. This has in the past been called black box, but there's some flexibility that might be needed there. But we know that 3 years prior to the attainment date, we can no longer rely on that flexibility. We need to define how we are going to get those emission reductions. So if we look at the previous slide of 2023 and 2031, 2023 is 108 tons there. That is not fully defined yet. By 2020, we're going to have to define that, right? Okay. And so again, that's going to be a forward-looking process rather than looking at past emission reductions. That's going to be trying to define how are we going to get those emission reductions in the future, unless we happen to attain by 2020, but I'm not sure that anybody thinks we're going to get there. So when it comes to PM 2.5, it's a similar kind of process. There's again a reasonable further progress process. It's a little bit different math. Instead of a 3% per year, it's a linear progress from baseline to attainment. So a little bit different math. But also there's not the same 182E5 flexibility that's allowed for PM 2.5. So there's different requirements there. How this ends up playing out here on slide 9 is if we look at each different year, say from now until 2023, and this process, I should say, will continue beyond 2023, on to 2031 and even beyond that. But just to kind of show, 2023 is our first sort of major milestone we need to hit. Every year we actually have things that we need to do when it comes to emission reductions. And some of this has been done already. So you see for every year, actually, we have an RFP, so a reasonable further progress that's required, whether it's for ozone or PM. We've actually made that demonstration already in the AQMP. And part of the way that we made that is that our baseline emissions moving forward are already being reduced through regulations that are on the books, and there's significant reductions from those regulations, and so that's already meeting our RFP requirements for every individual year. But in addition, in 2019 we have attainment, an attainment standard we have to hit. In 2020 we have to define that 182 E5. We have to get rid of that flexibility that's in there right now. We have an attainment date in 2021. That's again for PM. We've asked to bump our status up from moderate to serious, which bumps that attainment date out to 2025. We have an attainment date in 2022, and then the really big one is 2023. So if you look at the bottom of the slide, what's shown here is the different the different emissions levels that we actually have to hit for each one of these milestones. And what we see is that from 2021 and before, each one of those milestones is hit through our baseline reductions. We've made that demonstration that existing regulation should get us there out through 2021. But beyond that, we're going to need to do some more work, right? And that's part of the whole control strategy that we're working on. We can't rely on baseline reductions necessarily to get us there. And in addition, we're going to have to keep working on this 182 E5. So I bring all this up to just kind of again emphasize, as we're going through this process, part of the reason we're going through this facility-based measures process, there is a state strategy that's out there, but we have a lot of definition we still need to do. We still need to color in that picture a lot of what that control strategy is really going to look like, and these facility-based measures are one piece of that. Just a quick summary on this. So again, 2020 is really a key target we're looking at right now. Before 2023, we need to really define what that the further deployment measures are. The reasonable further progress we feel like we've already defined that and demonstrated that, but it's not enough on its own. We can't just rely on that process to get us there. And while CARB has made their commitments, we haven't. We also have our commitments on top of that. I do want to just point out one last thing. I'm going to go back again to slide 7. If we look at this bar chart and we see, for example, in 2023, that 108 tons, I think one of the things that we've been hearing is, so what's our target, right? Well, how does facility X, what do I need to reduce to? And I think what we're thinking of is, instead of a top-down target right now, we're working on a bottom-up approach. What are the emission reductions that are out there from existing commitments that might not already be in the inventory or might not be an assumption in the inventory? So how do we build up all the existing emission reductions that we think are out there to get at this 108 tons? Or what are some things that are voluntary measures that can be taken to try to start reducing these emissions from the 108 tons, rather than start from a top-down regulatory basis? We're trying to do this voluntary collaborative approach and build it from the bottom up. But that's where we're definitely going to need everybody's help in this room and on the phone, et cetera, to try to find out what those opportunities are. Okay, so I'm going to move on to slide 11. And when we think about the possible mechanisms, this is just a very broadly, how do we get SIP credit for an emission reduction? And how does that actually occur? So the simplest way that has been used traditionally in the past for many, if not most, emission reductions is through regulation, right? And you can have engine and fuel standards, in-use standards. Here at the district, obviously, we have some credit generation rules that can be expanded potentially. Indirect source rules, et cetera. So it's sort of a traditional regulatory approach from either EPA, ARB, or us. And so that's, I think, a well-known process when it comes to emission reductions. There's other things that happen along the way. For example, as we go through every RTP cycle, we go through every AQMP cycle, the emissions inventory gets modified for a variety of reasons, including growth adjustments, et cetera. And so that's one way that that can actually help and hurt, right? It depends on which way the inventory goes. But that's one way that there's adjustments that are made on the SIP and thinking about SIP credit. As we step down, we look at voluntary incentive programs, and this would be, traditional funding programs like Carl Moyer, HVIP, Prop 1B, et cetera. And so those are some incentive programs that are out there, and there's ways to try to get SIP credit on that. And then there's other voluntary measures. And when we say voluntary, this could be something that a local government decides to do or a local entity decides to do to go above and beyond existing regulations for whatever their own goals are to get emission reductions, right? So these are sort of four broad categories to try to get SIP credit. And we're, I think, going to be focusing a lot of our discussion really on these last two on the voluntary side. As we've looked at this here on slide 12, we talked about some of this slide on the previous presentation, talking about these integrity elements and what are the key pieces that are needed for any voluntary program to get SIP credit. And shown on it's some very small print there on the far right. It's sort of the four keywords of permanent, enforceable, quantifiable, and surplus. We need to make demonstrations that all the emission reductions meet those four words. I want to go through a little bit more detail how that actually works. There has been some guidance put out by EPA through the years that have refined this a little bit. What exactly is an enforceable commitment? What is required in a technical analysis? How do you demonstrate that there's authority, et cetera? So there's a number of requirements that have been added on to those four words and guidance that's available. One thing I did want to address right up front is that some of the original guidance, the VMAP guidance, stated that there is a cap of 3% for any voluntary program when it comes to mobile sources. And part of this is that was some of the original guidance that was out there. This was an innovative new strategy, and EPA was a little unsure how this was going to work out. And so they said at that time, they thought there was a 3% cap. Well, if you use that 3% today, that gives you a very small amount, only about 4 tons of emission reductions available through a voluntary approach. We know we need 108, so that's not going to be enough. But what has happened since then, that's back in 1997. EPA has issued some additional guidance since then saying that, look, they're willing to take a look at this on a case-by-case basis, that 3% is probably not a hard and fast rule. It is one approach that had been used before, and they'll look at this on a case-by-case basis moving forward as they're getting more and more comfortable with these programs. Slide 13, I want to kind of walk a little bit more through, these four keywords that are out there. And really what's important on these is how do you get prospective credit? How do you get credit looking into the future? So by 2020, we need to get all this prospective credit fully defined or much more defined than it is now. And so when we're thinking about permanent, well, what does permanent really mean? Really, it's just the emission reductions have to occur through the attainment date. So for example, if you have an incentive program that requires change out of a vehicle, but that vehicle useful life is over before an attainment date, it's not necessarily clear that that's permanent, right? So you have to show that the emission reductions will occur during the attainment timeframe. So then when we look at the enforceability, there's sort of a number of pieces on enforceability. One is, you can look at ensuring that the emission reductions actually occur, and then it's also ensuring that the commitment to get those emission reductions actually occur. It's a little bit different how that enforceability can work. So part of this is looking to make sure that the reductions are independently verifiable. And you have to know when it's not working, so you have to be able to define what the program violations are. Ultimately, this has to be, the public has to be able to review this information, right? And so they have to be able to access all the emissions-related information, and they have to have an ability to file suit against a responsible entity for those violations. And similarly, EPA has to have some enforceability on any program as well. So it's, just because one entity decides to make an emissions reductions program of their own, there has to be these extra pieces to make sure that this enforceability is there. The emission reductions have to be quantifiable, and this sounds fairly simple. It's just math, right? But anybody who's gone through these sorts of emission calculations can attest this can actually pose a challenge sometimes. One of the main things, it has to be reliable and replicatable, the calculations, and it has to be very well substantiated and documented. And then finally, surplus. You need to make sure that the emission reductions are actually above and beyond what's in the inventory. So say, for example, an entity decides, hey, I want to use a piece of Tier 4 construction equipment. That's beyond the existing requirement. True, but the inventory already assumes a certain level of Tier 4. And so does that one piece of construction equipment go beyond what is already in the inventory? How do you prove that that's surplus? That's one example. And so there's some requirements to make sure that that surplus, that the emission reductions are in fact surplus. Okay, so moving on to slide 14, I wanted to walk through the different sort of examples how this works. And so what we've developed here is this little diagram showing that there's sort of three entities, key entities that are involved when we're looking at these different kinds of programs, and especially if we're looking at how to get SIP credit. And so it's the traditional regulatory agencies, AQMD, ARB, EPA. Then you have local government, and that can be whoever it is at local government, city, county, districts, etc. And then you have private entities, for example, businesses, right? And that's sort of kind of three parts of a triangle, and that they have a relationship all with each other, right? They have direct relationships with each other, or maybe indirect relationships with each other, and that wrapped around that relationship, if we're going to try to get some sort of SIP credit, there's these integrity elements, and that can apply to any of the three in any sort of way possible. So what I want to do on this slide is walk through a little bit how some of these examples could work. So when we look at ways to get or mechanisms for SIP credit, we have traditional rules, we have MOUs, we have contracts. And then if we look at, well, what are the mechanisms to actually get an emission reduction? Just because you're getting SIP credit doesn't mean you're getting an emission reduction and vice versa, right? There's different instruments for that. You might have local ordinances, you might have permits, MOUs, contracts, etc. So as one example, if we look at a traditional regulatory approach, this would be a regulatory agency with some rule that affects business, right? So kind of the bottom part of that triangle. And we see the integrity elements, generally that falls more on the regulatory agency, right? There's a demonstration through the rulemaking process, the emission reductions are going to occur, they're quantifiable, surplus, permanent, et cetera, right? All those things really demonstrated through that rulemaking process. If there's any record keeping or tracking that's required, sometimes a little bit of that would be put on the business too, but it's dominantly the integrity elements are with the regulatory agencies. So that's a traditional approach. If we look at a traditional incentives approach, right, if you try to get funding to replace an engine, this is, rather than a rule, this is more of a contractual relationship. And again, this is typically between a regulatory agency and between a business, right? And so there's some sort of contract that's there, but the way the program is set up, the integrity elements are generally, again, on the regulatory agencies to ensure that the funding that is provided can actually give you the emission reductions that are quantifiable, enforceable, surplus, permanent, right? So that's all through the program. And so, for example, anybody who's gone through the application process for Carl Moyer, et cetera, knows it's a little detailed, and it's to make sure that all of those integrity elements are actually met, as well as other requirements. So maybe there's a different kind of regulatory approach. And so what's shown in this sort of diagram is what if there is a local ordinance or a permit that a local government has on its own with a business, that if a business wants to get a permit to operate in any kind of fashion with a local government, they have to go and either follow the ordinance or get a permit. And perhaps AQMD could have a rule with the local government, right, to make sure that program actually can get SIP credit, right? And so we actually have something like this a little bit in Rule 2202, that there's some delegation options in there with local government. And so there's examples where this can actually work and have happened before. It's not the traditional approach, but it's one approach. Quick question.
You have it set up there then, are you imagining then that the EPA or a citizen could sue? I'm assuming this is all going to be SIP approved, right? That they could sue the local government for not enforcing the ordinance. Is that how you're thinking this is going to work?
In this example, the way I'm describing it now, we'll get into some more details on specifics a little later, so it will be variable. But I think for this particular example, it's because if we have a rule, the district has a rule, then it's up to us to enforce the rule, right? And so the enforcement is really more on us. And so if there's a suit, it would probably come to us to say, hey, you aren't enforcing your own rules, right? It's not necessarily on the local government if it's a lawsuit to make sure that there's SIP credit, right?
So EPA, I'm just trying to understand, EPA and local citizens have the right under the Clean Air Act to ensure enforcement. So I'm just trying to understand who enforces against who. Is it that EPA would enforce against the local government saying, hey, you're not implementing your ordinance? Or is it EPA coming to AQMD and saying you have to enforce against the local government because they're not implementing their ordinance?
So I think it could work both ways, and it depends on the rule. So if there's a facility, for instance, that's subject to one of our rules, that rule is SIP approved, that once it's SIP approved, it's equivalent to an EPA rule, so it can be enforced directly on the facility. In this case, I'm thinking 2202, which may or may not be fully SIP approved, but is, if any entity is subject to one of our rules and it's SIP approved, I think some of that enforceability can carry through. It depends on the obligations as they're written in the rule. But you can imagine another situation, especially here, where the obligation, the commitment came at say the CARB or the AQMD level, and then through agreements that may not be like enforceable through a SIP, but agreements between, say, CARB or AQMD and whatever entity is out there, which are enforceable separately. You could have some situations that are like that, but that the enforceability from EPA's perspective would come, and from citizens' perspective would be on the agency, the district or CARB.
So I just have one other follow-up question, just to make sure so I understand this. So if you're envisioning the situation where EPA could go after the local jurisdiction, then whatever the mechanism is, an ordinance or an MOU between the local government and the individual businesses, would those mechanisms have to be submitted? Are you envisioning
It
those
depends
would
on
be
the
submitted
situation,
to
and it needs to be worked
EPA
through, but
and be in the SIP? So all those individual MOUs and ordinances would be submitted to EPA and be part of the SIP.
the procedures may be, but it could be that it depends where the commitment is made. If the district or CARB makes a commitment, and that commitment meets all the integrity elements, then it would be enforceable. Again, we got to work through some of this with EPA, but the idea is it would be enforceable upon CARB or AQMD, not necessarily on the other entity. And it depends on how much has to be SIP approved and how much is not necessarily part of that SIP approval. But these are complicated issues, and it case by case could be very different depending on what you're talking about. So we're working closely with EPA, and CARB is working with EPA, and we're working with CARB on all these kind of questions that come up. But for example, I would give you an example of a rule that probably is not enforceable all the way through. Like if you have a rule on our wood burning rule, right? It affects a wide variety of sources. It's our responsibility to make sure that that is enforced and that we achieve the emission reductions that we committed to. Nobody's claiming that, citizen suit can happen against a particular resident.
Right, but I guess the point I'm trying to ask, it's a pretty narrow question.
Right.
And it's whether if you're going to have the local government, if you're going to have the EPA enforce against the local government, so it's under that circumstance, do those individual ordinances and MOUs that they have with business, are you envisioning that those would have to be SIP approved? That's all I'm asking.
That's one potential situation. That's not what we're talking about as like what we're proposing to do. But in that situation, I think it also depends on how it's set up, on what our rule says or our relationship with the local government, and how the local government commit to provide all the information needed to us and then to EPA that is needed to get SIP credit without necessarily having to figure out how they're going to get that information. Just like a business is committing to put on a certain level of controls, but they're not committing to which manufacturer they're going to get there. So there's different levels that we need to work through.
And I think a big part of this is how is that commitment defined, right? How are you committing to those emission reductions? And are you committing to a broad, yes, we'll get X tons through this mechanism or through another mechanism? And that's the commitment. It's this plus that. Or is it we are only going to do through this ordinance and that ordinance is everything? And that's the commitment, right? It depends on how the commitment ends up being structured.
And I wanted to point out an example that it's not always the case that the local government would be the one that would be liable or would be subject to enforcement. It depends on how we structure the mechanism. So just for an example, we have a dust control rule here in the South Coast Air Basin that is in the SIP and therefore enforceable by EPA against the construction activities themselves that are subject to the rule. But also in the Coachella Valley, we had adopted a model ordinance in many of the cities, maybe even all of them, I don't remember for sure, and the county had adopted that model ordinance, and those ordinances were then put into the SIP, and so those are now enforceable by citizens and EPA against the entity that's subject to the ordinance. You don't need to enforce against local government because it's directly enforceable against the entity that's subject to the dust control requirement. So that's one model that we have used in the past, but it's not the only potential model.
Aileen's question sparks a question in my mind. If, as you point out, that these measures may have different points of enforceability, if CARB has taken the commitment under the mobile strategy to for further development of technology, and we're supporting them in that regard, why do all and presumably that commitment contains all the integrity elements? Why do all the integrity elements need to follow to what we're doing here?
So we don't know yet, but to the extent that 108 tons and whatever it is in 2031 get approved using some 182E5 flexibility, they will not meet, all the integrity elements. So we could sit back and wait for CARB to figure out how by 2020 they're gonna fill in that gap, but we have an obligation, we have board direction, we have a commitment to help fill that. So that's what this is about. This is trying to help define that in a way that all the integrity elements are there before 2020 when it comes due. So CARB will do their part to do that, and we're going to do our part to help them fill that gap.
But is it, I guess in my mind, it's to me, CARB's made the commitment to the prospective emission reductions. Why aren't we more focused on the actual emission reductions?
The emission reductions that matter are the emission reductions that will occur in our attainment years. So emission reductions now, a project now to reduce emission reductions, we look at it in terms of the emission reductions the surplus emission reductions that will be there in 2023. So we need to act now and do projects that will continue to have emission reductions year after year, but especially in 2023. In 2020, we have to say very specifically what all those measures are. We don't want to wait till 2020 to scramble. We're starting now to figure out how to define it.
Not suggesting waiting.
Huh?
I'm not suggesting waiting.
So one approach is, as Ian mentioned, there's lots of projects happening. There's incentive programs out there. There's lots of agreements. There's settlement agreements. There's other agreements that on every leg of this triangle that are happening and may not already be in the inventory. And there'll be more agreements and more actions taken on every leg of this triangle that are not yet in the SIP. Every time that happens, we should be figuring out how to calculate the benefit in 2023. And once we do that, we need to figure out how to shave off a little bit of that 108 tons a day, right? That's the very basic piece of what we're trying to do. So maybe in an ideal world, by the time we get to 2020, we've completely shaved off it's gone. We've shaved it all off. We've all made them SIP credible. Tough task, obviously, but that's the idea. Now,
I guess my question
yeah.
is, in doing that, it doesn't seem that it's automatically necessary that they be enforceable here locally if we get real emission reductions.
If it's
are
not
less-
enforceable, then it doesn't shave the 108.
But it doesn't
But
have
it's
to. It doesn't have to be
enforceable at
local.
CARB.
It could be with CARB, right? So on
Yeah.
this triangle,
Enforceability is with
you see
CARB.
it's
It could be enforceable with CARB. That's absolutely correct. It could
Or-
be enforceable with us.
or
It-
EPA.
Yeah.
So Thomas, I think I hear you maybe questioning why we have so much focus on making these measures SIP creditable as opposed to just focusing on getting emission reductions. Is that sort of what you're still struggling with?
A bit, yeah.
And I think Phil's point is that we know that in 2020, CARB is going to have to submit a measure or group of measures that will be SIP creditable, SIP enforceable, that will get 108 tons of emission reductions. If we are able, and it's pretty mind-boggling to imagine what that might be, you know, other than ban driving heavy-duty vehicles and locomotives and a wide variety of other equipment. If we're not able to chip away at that obligation in advance, as Phil was explaining. If we only get emission reductions, we can't take credit for those until they actually occur. If they're not SIP creditable, we can't take credit for them until they actually occur, which will be too late to chip away at that 108 tons. What we want to be able to do is adopt a measure that says we will get emission reductions through the coming years, and that's enforceable, that meets all the requirements, and therefore, let's say we can take 3 tons or 5 tons or however many tons of credit that we can take off that 180 ton obligation. So it's to make it more realistic that we'll be able to, or that CARB will be able to actually meet that obligation in 2020.
So it's a matter of timing. If the missions occur, we can take credit for them. If they're still prospective come 2020, that's when we need to rely on enforceability.
That I would agree with that.
To get any prospective credit, it has to meet these elements. Can you hit the button?
Press it gentle.
That maybe we're not captured in the SIP already, and we're looking to tease them out to identify what's, and it's based off of some agreement, but that agreement is not one that the entity itself wants to become enforceable than to create a citizen suit to be, but we rather keep the good practice, keep getting the emissions reduction, continue doing the good work. Does it not, can you not take SIP credit at all unless it becomes something that then otherwise has to be subject to a citizen suit? Because I think that's I'm trying to understand that requirement and where that's coming from.
So, I mean, the best way to look at this is examples, and I know Ian has a lot more animation on this slide, but again, like agreements in the past may have not anticipated that this was coming, right? So the agreements that we maybe, but a settlement agreement with a development or some, hypothetically, may not have anything in the agreement for one party to provide to the other party, to us or CARB or EPA or any local city, all the information that would be required to make it SIP creditable. So in the future, if we want it to be SIP creditable, those agreements are going to have those mechanisms to provide all that information, the tracking, to make it SIP creditable. But whether that agreement is enforceable through the SIP or submitted to the SIP versus a commitment, let's say, by as an example, a commitment by AQMD, they, we're looking for $1 billion a year. Let's just say we get $100 million a year in incentive funding. We could find a way to make a commitment to EPA that we're going to use that $100 million to incentivize the change out of so many trucks and so much equipment. We might have some examples in there, but we have the flexibility to kind of choose the entities and choose the equipment as we go. So the enforceability, if we get SIP credit for that, the enforceability is on us. We said we will get those emission reductions with this funding. And if we don't, part of that commitment is we will make up the difference somehow and have a procedure to do so, transparent, everyone can track it. But the actual agreements that get reached to carry that out between us and a business or us and a city are still open. But those agreements might be enforceable between us and the city, just like an MOU would be enforceable or a contract would be enforceable. So through that and through those agreements, we would have to have mechanisms in there to provide us with the assurance that we will get the information we need in order to prove to EPA that we're meeting our commitment. But it wouldn't be part of the SIP, each agreement necessarily, but it would, the tracking pieces, the data, the information would have to be submitted to EPA to show that we are following through on our commitment. Does that make sense?
You know, to follow up, I think one thing that you're getting at is, you know, maybe a local entity would want to have all the enforceability on their own. They don't want to have somebody on top of them enforcing. There's different ways to structure this too. I mean, you could have a structure where, you know, a local government says, we have a policy in place that's going to get us 90% reduction in something. But what's actually put into the SIP through an MOU or a rule or something like that, and the relationship between a regulatory agency and that entity would be, well, they have a commitment for 90%, but we're only going to take credit for 75 because that's all that that entity is comfortable with. They don't know if they can actually get there. Maybe it's a goal, it's a policy goal, but it's not actually going to get there. But the enforceable commitment on the sort of the EPA citizen suit side might not be the full 90. Maybe it's something less, right? So there's different ways to try to build that in.
Ian, just one last thing. On one of your other slides, I think it was 11, you talked about the different mechanisms. And I'm wondering if you said we were going to just focus on the voluntary incentive program and the other voluntary measures. But it seems like we should also focus on the new information and assumptions, because if you're saying this is a potential way of getting creditable emissions, because it seems like if a government agency, for example, wants to expend money on, turning over their fleet faster, then that would change the assumptions in the SIP, and they could get credit that way, and then it wouldn't be enforceable. I mean, it would be they would have already done it. You're going to get the credit, and then there's no need to make it enforceable through an ordinance or through some other mechanism. So can we add that to the way that we're looking to these different options?
So that gets into how the inventories are created and whether it meets the criteria that would qualify it for baseline emission reductions. Because if you're assuming that action is occurred and is going to occur, then the next time you do your AQMP modeling or your SIP modeling and your attainment modeling, you assume it's going to happen and it goes into your baseline reductions instead of your control strategy. And that has been used in various ways in the past. The problem is it only happens when you can only happen when you entirely redo your entire attainment modeling strategy, which occurs pretty much every time we do an AQMP, but they're 3 or 4 years apart.
Well, actually, though, I've seen other jurisdictions, and I even think South Coast has submitted updated emission inventories along the way. So I'm just saying, why can't we also explore this option? Because it would maybe make a lot of local jurisdictions more comfortable. And it would be a great way to get credit for the emission reductions without having to deal with this enforceability issue.
Yeah, typically when those are submitted along the way, it's to show that we're whole, like there was another commitment that didn't pan out the way we thought. So we go back and look at what happened between the last time we did the attainment modeling and that point and say, yeah, we might have been a couple tons short, but we're going to show you that we made it up. It's not so much a complete change to the baseline inventory. So, I mean, I'm happy to discuss that, and with EPA as well, who's in the room, but there's some difficulties there as well, but I understand what you're saying.
I think one of the other challenges is, again, on the permanent piece of it. So if there's a local decision to change out its fleet, how do you know that they don't change their mind again, right? And so it's not impossible, but there's a a bit
I don't
here.
mean to belabor this, but you have the same issue with the other assumptions in the SIP. For example, one assumption in the SIP is population, and that's not enforceable, and population changes. Another one is vehicle miles traveled, number of vehicle trips. You know, the list goes on and on and on. So I don't see why it would seem that an assumption associated with how many vehicles a local jurisdiction has already purchased would probably be the most stable assumption we probably have in the AQMP.
We can explore it.
Yeah, again, I think in the past, the decision when you're doing the inventory of what isn't baseline is always a decision as to what the best information you have available at the time in terms of growth projections, population, fleet mix, and there's so much data and stuff that goes into that. But I don't think it's ever really been done to that extent in interim periods. It's something we could think about, but we'll talk to EPA. But I think it's hard for EPA to just throw out all these integrity elements and have this alternative method and essentially get to the same place. We'd have to talk to them.
Okay. So I think we'll keep getting through the rest of this diagram. I think we touched on a lot of it already, but just to sort of complete this. So one of the things that can be different too on the integrity elements on this sort of piece of it is who's responsible for the integrity elements. And you can have it instead of just being on the regulatory agency side, you can actually shift those a little bit over to the local government side, or potentially even on the local government on the business side. And so that they can kind of, in this model, they can sort of float around where that can actually go, right? Okay, so we talked about this a little bit on a potential voluntary approach. Again, this is sort of you have some permit that a business wants to get from a local government. So that is occurring first. We're calling this voluntary only in that it's the local government decides to do it or the business decides that it wants to go do something and it needs to get a permit. So that gets it from the local government. And then again, there's an MOU between a regulatory agency and the local government, which ensures that that permit might have an emission reduction associated with it, but that emission reduction can actually make its way into the SIP. That would have to be the MOU would be the mechanism for doing that, right? And then obviously it's a triangle. It's 3 times 3 times 3 times 3 times. I mean, there's a lot of different combinations that can happen with this sort of thing. And this is just a brief illustration of that point. Okay.
Just one thing to add, I think in our thinking and putting this together, we probably were thinking of entities like airports and ports more in the local government category than on the business category. And so when you're thinking of these relationships, I think that makes sense.
Yeah. On this slide, we have links to a variety of different guidance documents from EPA if folks are really interested in getting into the weeds on this. I will say that this is what we're talking about might be breaking new ground on some areas, so we do have to continue to talk to EPA and CARB about all this. Phil mentioned it, but there is some guidance that's available, and so that's available on this page, and it's also linked on our FBMSM page. At this point, I mean, we've had some good discussion here. We've been going for about an hour. We have about the same number of slides to go through on specific examples. I don't know if we want to just take 3, 4, 5 minutes, quick restroom break, come back here, let's say in 5 minutes, and we'll finish this off. Okay. Or do people want to just keep going? Do we just blast through? I don't know what folks want to do. I'm not sure. Let's take a quick break. We'll come back fast. So we'll get started in about a minute here. All right, folks, if we could start taking our seats, let's go ahead and see if we can't wrap up where we're going.
So we're going to go ahead and get started, but before Ian gets back to the presentation, I mentioned it in passing, but we do have EPA staff here today. So on any of the discussion we just had, if you had any questions of EPA on some of this stuff, they're here to answer those questions. They also, for them and others here, before you speak or ask questions, if you can identify yourself, so we start getting to know each other a little better and people know where you're coming from. So. Did we finish with questions on the last piece? I know we discussed it as we went. Is there anything else before Ian gets rolling again? Okay, so go ahead.
All right. So we went largely through sort of theoretical discussion on this, but I thought it would be helpful if we could go through some specific examples, and these would not be all-encompassing. These are just some potential examples to walk through when thinking about SIP credit and what are some of the complications that come up when you get into each specific example. And so there's 6 in particular we want to go through. We wanted to make sure to cover one that would be potentially applicable to each of the facility-based measures. But we did want to start with one general example, and this is Portola up in Northern California outside of Sacramento. They have a PM 2.5 plan that's an air quality management plan with the Northern Sierra AQMD, and that was actually just approved by CARB in February of this year. It's currently under review by EPA, so it has not yet been approved by EPA, but it actually includes one of their key, if not the key, attainment strategy is a wood stove changeout program. Almost all of their PM 2.5 during episodes of bad PM are from wood stoves. And so their main strategy is to change out wood stoves. And they actually have a grant that they got. So they essentially have money in hand already. And they have this voluntary incentive measure to change out the stoves. And that incentive measure includes replacing the stoves, destroying the old ones to make sure that they aren't being used, and it's not just adding new stoves, but it's cleaner burning stoves, and it's all a voluntary measure. There's a link here on the bottom of this page in case you're interested in the details of this. But the key thing is that this is a prospective SIP measure, right, with an incentive, a voluntary incentive program. So if we go back to thinking about this triangle approach, this would be more of a contractual relationship between a regulatory body and what's a private entity, right? So homeowners or maybe businesses that might have wood stoves. Most of the integrity elements here would be done with the regulatory agencies. That's a Northern Sierra AQMD. So when we think about the integrity elements, and how does that work for this particular example? So one, if we think about surplus, so there aren't any other requirements for this, right? That's one of the key pieces. There aren't any other rules that require change out of wood stoves or any sort of in-use requirements, federal or state level. So any reductions that are occurring here would be surplus. It's quantifiable in that there's an EPA-approved method for calculating emissions from these different sorts of wood stoves. And so by using an EPA-approved method, that sort of takes care of the quantified piece of this. It's permanent in that the stoves are actually destroyed. I don't know if I'm assuming they're not burned, but the stoves are destroyed, so they can't be used again, right? So it's ensuring that it's permanent. And then it's the enforceability piece. There's a lot of record keeping, tracking, certification, inspection. There's a lot of sort of enforcement and compliance pieces on this. But the other bit is that there's an enforceable commitment to add a substitute measure if there's a shortfall. That's really a critical element of this. And so this is sort of all what kind of makes up these integrity elements for this particular plan. There's a lot of devil in the details here. If you go and try to read the documentation, it's many, many, many pages of it, but we try to distill it down, and these we think are the key pieces of this particular program. What we do note that is we're sure EPA is having to consider this, as we talked earlier about the 3% cap. This was essentially their entire attainment strategy. Now then, the scale is considerably different than what we're trying to do. They have a single source, which is an issue which they're dealing with. They have money in hand, so they have a different situation than what we're facing right now. But it's just another bit to consider. Okay, I'll move on to another example. And this would be the Tier 2 MOU between ARB and the railroads. And this was signed in 1998, and it had some requirements in it for later years, the 2010 to 2030 timeframe, that locomotives in the South Coast Basin, the annual fleet average must be equal to Tier 2 or greater. And this was consistent with a measure in the 94 SIP. And this was ultimately approved by EPA, and there was a backstop commitment by EPA that if these emission reductions did not occur, then EPA would take action to backstop any sort of shortfall that's out there. This MOU did give us an emission reduction. It's about 30% below what any existing regulation had at the time for that inventory, and it's still in place today. And you can go on ARB's website, and there's annual tracking of this. There's crediting provisions, the math on how to actually calculate a Tier 2 average. It gets a little complex, but they actually have annual reporting on this, and it's available on ARB's website. I guess when we look at sort of what is on this little triangle, again, how do we think about this? This is more of a, sort of an MOU approach, right? This is not a rule, not a contract. This is an MOU or an incentive contract. This is an MOU but again, it's directly between a regulatory entity and a business or businesses. So when we think about the integrity elements, so is it surplus? Well, yes, it is surplus because it goes above and beyond what was in the inventory. It's about a 30% reduction for at least in 2010. It's quantifiable. There's a lot of different emission calculations that go into it. You have to take into account the crediting provisions. So the math can get quite complex, but it's doable, right? I mean, that's the main takeaway from this is even if it's complex, it's doable. It is permanent in that it goes through attainment dates, the key attainment dates that we're looking at anyway, or at least when that SIP measure was put into place. It does also require permanent tracking and record keeping and an ongoing compliance mechanism to make sure that it continues to occur through time. And now then it's also enforceable in that there's both enforceability of the MOU between ARB and the railroads. That's enforceable on its own. But then again, EPA also has its own commitment to take action if there is a shortfall. So all those pieces are there. One other thing that I wanted to bring up that something we might want to explore as part of these facility-based measures is there a potential to get extra credit? If there is additional reductions beyond this MOU, is there a way to get extra credit? Because the MOU doesn't go beyond where it currently is, but maybe there's, we have Tier 4 engines that are available for purchase today. Is there a way to build on this? So that's not in the current MOU, but it's something to maybe explore. Oh, question.
There we go. Thank you. I'm sorry. Gail Shiomoto, Law, representing the City of Mission Viejo. I did want to ask this general question about MOUs. There was the earlier question by, I believe it was Eileen, in terms of baseline versus non-baseline. Here you have an example where this particular MOU has already been approved. It's already been identified as being a SIP eligible. Say, for example, is AQMD looking at investigating existing MOUs that are already on the books but which have not been crafted to be SIP eligible? And the only reason I ask this, and this also gets into the future situation as well, is then you start getting into an aspect of reopening up MOUs or development agreements or whatever entities that have already been entered into, say, between a local government and between a business or a company or an entity. So I just wanted to bring that out now. You haven't mentioned it, but I thought I would just raise it because you have mentioned that, there may be things that are in the baseline that haven't gotten credit, and I did not know what AQMD's focus or approach was on that particular issue.
Sure. So I think we are interested in looking at existing commitments that are already out there, but I don't know that it's something where we are looking to, at this point, impose an authority on that. It's more if there are existing agreements that various stakeholders think we should be aware of and something we should try to pursue for SIP credit, that's what we want to take a look at. This is if there's something that you have, an MOU that you already have that you just don't want to touch and don't want to bring into this process, that's not something that we're trying to pursue right now. So I think that answers your question.
Not all MOUs are created equal. Some are dissolved if either party wants to exit. That is something that probably would not be considered necessarily enforceable, but others are crafted so both parties would have to agree to exit. That's probably a little more enforceable. So there is some discomfort at various levels with MOUs and even at our board level over past potential actions, but it really can depend on how the agreement is set up.
Okay. So we'll move on here to slide 22. So thinking about the ports, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Clean Air Action Plan. I think everybody's aware that this is out there. We aren't really going to touch on the recent updated draft that's been released. This is just more of a general discussion. There's obviously the existing 2010 cap that's already out there. And thinking about, well, how to try to get credit for something like the cap. And there's really, again, there's multiple mechanisms possible. And I think one of the things that, trying to think about this, you can say, well, there's the existing sort of incentive approach, right, where we might have incentive programs to change out equipment and all that. And so there's either an MOU or a contract directly between us and a business. And that relationship already exists and can continue to exist in the future. And there's pieces of that might be part of the cap. Stepping back from that, we can say, well, maybe is there a way to do some umbrella MOU between ourselves and the ports to sort of take a general credit for the cap itself of some level of general credit. And there's pluses and minuses to doing it that way. A different way to do it is maybe a measure-specific MOU on an individual measure. Maybe you craft MOUs on each individual one so that it's sort of more tailored. And again, that would be potentially between us and the ports. It doesn't mean that it couldn't necessarily be done between a regulatory agency and an individual tenant. It can just get unwieldy the smaller and more granular you go. We have 17 million people and a lot of different businesses that are out there. It gets harder the smaller you go on it. But that's certainly possible too, to do it kind of a lower or a smaller scale. And then obviously rules, right? There's indirect source rules, there's credit generation rules, there's other kind of rules that are out there. So there's a variety of different ways to try to get SIP credit when it comes to looking at the cap. There's many different measures that are in the cap, as folks are aware. What we wanted to talk about for this particular example is just let's take a hypothetical and let's look at the vessel speed reduction program. That's in the existing 2010 cap already. And what that does is it offers an incentive to shippers to, if they reduce their speeds within 20 nautical miles or 40 nautical miles of the port, they get a financial incentive on their wharfage. So the gist of it is that the slower you go, the lower your NOx, right? So the idea here is to say, well, what if we did a measure-specific MOU on the vessel speed reduction program, and so that the way this would work would be there would be some sort of contract, lease agreement between, in this case, the ports would be the local government and their various tenants that are out there, and then we would develop an MOU between ourselves and the ports. So how might this sort of example work? And thinking about these integrity elements, one of the things that we would need to do is to take a look, is this above and beyond the baseline emissions inventory? And this gets a little bit to some of the question you raised, Aileen, about, what is surplus? How do you determine whether or not this is already in there, or can you just make adjustments anyway based on activity levels? And so there'd have to be some work done on this to make sure that there is an actual surplus emission reduction here. The other piece of this, though, is that if this is an incentive program, and this is incentives being offered, for example, by the ports, a financial incentive, the surplus is only up to the amount that there is incentive funding available, right? So if, as an extreme example, there's, only $1 million available, and that only covers, 10 trips, we can't take more credit than 10 trips, right? That sort of approach. The surplus is only as much as is available on the incentive side. It has to be quantifiable. Again, we've gone through this. There have to be ways to calculate this and using approved methods, and that they have to be consistent with the SIP, so that as folks have gone through these sorts of calculations, know the math can get quite complex, and you have to have a consistent level of math across the SIP inventory calculations and what you're going to be doing in this approach. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but it has to be consistent. Thinking about permanent, we need to make sure, again, this program would be, available through the attainment dates. There has to be monitoring, tracking, record keeping, etc. Enforceability, again, we've talked a lot about this already. The idea would be that potentially on this MOU, in this example, that the commitment would be, AQMD would have the MOU with the ports, and the MOU could be structured that we AQMD would commit to getting these emission reductions from a vessel speed reduction program or some other measure if there's a shortfall, right? And that's the commitment. And so the enforceability then potentially in that example would fall more on AQMD than directly on, for example, on the shippers or directly on the ports, at least in this particular example. We touched on this before. The level of emission reductions could vary between the MOU and the port's policy. So that's one of the challenges with an incentive program. How many people decide to take that incentive, right? And how do you determine how many people are going to decide to take that incentive? And how do you get prospective credit for that? And so one of the ways to structure it is that, well, maybe there's a goal with the incentive program of a 90% compliance or whatever the number is that you're shooting for, but you say, well, we don't think we can do that on an enforceable basis. At that level, we're going to scale it back a little bit within the MOU. So we're only going to take some lesser amount of credit, right? So that way, if you're worried about the enforceability, it's only on the lower amount. And then you also have to make sure that there's resources dedicated to ensure that there is actual compliance. So if someone says, I'm going, slower at 39 miles out, then they actually have to be going slower and making sure that there is a way to actually ensure compliance. Yeah, question.
I have a question on this one in particular, and this goes to my earlier question about timing. You asked about how, the nature of the program in order to get prospective credit. But this is a program that's been in place for 15 years and has been tremendously successful for more than 15 years. And we've never been able to answer that question. In fact, now I suspect, unless you guys are artificially increasing the baseline of your transiting emissions, this is now part of the baseline. It's actual. How does this work into what we're discussing today? Because this is the disconnect I see in the discussion of voluntary measures. It's real, it's actual, it's been ongoing, tremendously successful.
Absolutely. And whether it's in baseline or not is something you have to dig into and look at what was assumed in baseline, or if anything, and what actually is occurring. And for RFP purposes, you do need those interim to show that you're meeting those interim goals. But what's most important is that the program is still in place and still has money at the attainment date and beyond, right? That's really the critical piece. Now, you can ask, well, why are we even doing this up front? But obviously there's short-term health benefits, short-term emission benefits. It also goes to show that it is a successful program. It also goes to show that, with this amount of money, we can achieve those reductions. We're not just theoretically saying we're going to do it. Like, we can just continue this, and as long as we continue this and the money's there, it'll continue in 2023 and beyond, and we'll take that credit, assuming it's not already been taken credit for, either through a regulation or through some other baseline adjustment, assuming it was going to occur.
But we've never been able to, other than through the baseline, and I assume it's in there because I know you guys work with the ports on the inventory, you've never taken credit for this program.
Well, we're going to try. That's the point of the discussion.
Why is an MOU necessary? By analogy, you don't assume in 2023 that vehicle occupancy rates will go to 1. You assume that the consistent operational behavior continues.
Well, I mean, at some point I could ask EPA about. I would think if I were EPA, I would say anything I put in baseline essentially is going to have to meet the same elements as what you're going to take credit for in a measure, right? Now, you have to justify baseline in various ways. It's a snapshot. You use the best assumptions you have available at that time, but at the end of the day, you're going to end up in the same place. But the way I look at this example is this, right? I mean, it seems like enforceability is something that people are worried about. We have Carl Moyer now. We get money. We provide incentives for truckers to upgrade their trucks or buy cleaner trucks than they would otherwise purchase. We can implement that program. We know how to do it. We've been doing it. We have the authority to implement it. It's great. We do all the tracking. We do all the integrity elements, and we can find ways to get SIP credit we have in the past and we will in the future. A vessel speed reduction program, that it's hard for us to implement. We're not there. So if you think of this MOU as just an extension, like we're making a commitment, we're going to have a vessel speed reduction program in Southern California. We can't really implement it ourselves. So we're going to work out something with the ports so they kind of implement it for us and defines where the money's coming from, defines how long, defines the information exchange such that we need in order to do it. It's almost like if we contracted out Carl Moyer 100% to some third-party entity. So it's kind of that contractual relationship that's kind of just allowing somebody else to implement a program that we are ultimately responsible for. I know that's different than your question, but on your question, if this has not gotten credit before, we need to find ways for things like this to get SIP credit, because we can't afford not to get SIP credit anymore for things that aren't.
And I think just to piggyback on what you just said, looking to find ways to get to identify what is SIP creditable on programs that are in place and have been in place and are performing well really does require us, whether we want to or not. I mean, I think we really do need to open up the 2012 baseline so that we can understand what was actually
Absolutely.
accounted for, what wasn't, and that will help all of us really understand what our future targets could be. I mean, it helps us fashion our whole program to be a partner with you. So I would hope that at one of our next coming meetings, we could really delve into the 2012 baseline.
Yeah, that's more than one meeting. But I would say that as we start looking at specific actions that could be taken at any of these measures, that's when we really have to define what's surplus or not, and whether these potential actions are surplus. And that's when, for each individual case, we could dig into baseline and see if it's there or not. I wish there's probably people at CARB or even here that know these answers right now, what's in baseline and what's not in baseline. I just don't have it off the top of my head, or sometimes no, because there's hundreds of assumptions and calculations that go into that baseline. So as we think, like if it's vessel speed reduction, yeah, we can get that answer at some point pretty quickly from CARB, what they put into that inventory. Same with the MOU on the railroads. I just don't have the answer today. But yeah, that's a critical piece of all of this once we get moving on those actions.
Can I ask you just a follow-up question to these two questions? So at the beginning, you were talking about the inventory you're looking at affecting is the CARB sort of black box inventory, right?
Which inventory is this?
The one that you're looking to get emission reductions from.
It's the further deployment measures that CARB has in there in the state SIP strategy.
Are you just then going to be looking at that inventory? You're going to be looking at any inventory to get that would substitute in then for those emission reductions?
That's not inventory, that's a commitment. So for any measure that proposes to do something that we think is additional to what's in baseline or what's otherwise required, we have to do a very close look to see if it's surplus, right? So if it's not, it's already there, then perhaps we're good, or perhaps somebody doesn't like what's in the baseline, or maybe we got to beef that up. I mean, this goes back to the last Clean Air Action Plan by the ports and the backstop rule. There was a lot of discussion around baseline inventories around that. So I think when we submit anything into the SIP, it becomes part of the SIP. So the difference between making a big distinction between what's in baseline and what get credit towards a reduction, and I don't think it's as big a distinction. You put in a measure, you put in a rule into the SIP, it gets adopted. Essentially what that's doing, the emission reductions in that measure are essentially adjusting the baseline downward in a way. It's helping to fill your commitment. It's whether you just take it off the top or the bottom.
Maybe I didn't articulate my question very well. I apologize. What I was trying to find out was the actions that you're proposing to take. And let's just say some of those actions might be adjusting assumptions in the baseline to take, to take credit for things that are already happening. Would that then lessen the amount of emission reductions that you're trying to get from CARBs? And I'm just going to call it the black box, the 100 and whatever emissions reductions that they don't have a way to get yet.
I think the answer is yes, and as Ian mentioned earlier, we're trying to do this from the bottom up, right? We're trying to see what are the opportunities. So if there's no opportunities or it's already accounted for, then we're going to have to move on.
I was just trying to understand which one, so you answered my question. Thank you.
It could be less than 108 if those are real and are out there.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right, we'll keep going. Actually, I just want to touch again on this sort of the baseline and coming back to baseline. We can spend a lot of time going through baseline assumptions. I think what might be better on that, and I think we were speaking this morning, individual discussions on that, individual assumptions. I think that's probably a better, more productive way to do it. I think when bringing this group together, I don't know if it's worth taking all the time to go do that in this big group setting. So I think individual conversations, staff, we've already started some of those conversations, and we definitely want to continue those. So, okay. Wanted to move on to a different example, and so this would be looking at the sustainable community strategies, right? And this is included within the regional transportation plan. This is a requirement that was first put in the 2012 RTP, requires an 8% reduction in 2020, a 13% reduction in 2035 on a CO2 basis per capita. Looking largely at different land use patterns and trying to make sure that there's, for example, higher density and high quality transit areas and that sort of thing. And so there's the SCS is baked fully into the RTP. But what the example we wanted to look at is, well, what if a local jurisdiction has some local policies, ordinances, what have you, that go beyond the SCS, right? They might have just their own reasons that they want to go beyond the SCS. Maybe they really want to do very, very high density in a high quality transit area, or different kinds of transportation policies that go beyond the SCS. And that would be enforced really through the local jurisdiction would do that through their own ordinance. And so one potential way to maybe try to take credit for this is to AQMD in this potential example could say, well, maybe we could adopt a rule that's more of an opt-in rule. It wouldn't necessarily have to be mandatory. It could just be for cities that want to take advantage of it. This rule would provide the framework so that any ordinance would actually be able to get SIP credit, right? And it's just to provide that framework of a rule that could do that. And so the way that this would work again in this little triangle is that you would have, the ordinance that would be between essentially the development community and the local government, and then AQMD would have its own rule between the local government and the district. And the integrity elements would probably sort of flow in all examples in this case.
Ian, if I can,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Does a rule and an ordinance always go together? I mean, you have to have a rule to force, or not force, but to have the local jurisdiction create an ordinance. Okay.
No.
Okay.
This is just one example. There's a lot of examples out there. Question? I think you have to set it flat and be gentle. Be gentle on the button. There it is.
Thank you, Andy. Gail Shiamoto, Lore again, with the City of Mission Viejo. Perhaps it's the choice of this particular example with respect to application to local jurisdiction, but I had a very difficult time with this particular example. I did consult with SCAG staff last night to let them know, take a look at slides 24 and 25, and I know SCAG will be looking into it, but I think from a broader perspective, knowing how much SCAG is trying to utilize any policies and programs and to push the envelope to reach the anticipated greenhouse gas reduction targets that are being proposed by ARB, I was trying to just get a handle as to what types of specific and illustrative examples you had in mind that would be above and beyond any assumptions and any policy programs that are either in the adopted 2016 RTP SCS or could be envisioned for the 2020 RTP SCS. Even the example of density, I don't know if there's a specific density threshold that's in the RTP SCS for for TOD development, and whether or not any local ordinance would really already be embedded in what is already in a larger concept versus a specific number. So I guess that's the first thing is if this one is pursued further, I would hope there could be some very technical discussions between AQMD staff and with SCAG staff to sort of understand what is already embedded in the assumptions for the RTP SCS. Is there really anything out there that a local jurisdiction could even consider to take advantage of this particular example? And then provide us maybe with some examples of what they would be. So that's sort of my very, very, very first thought. The other thing too is I know you emphasize this with cities and counties, but some of your emphases on also transit would sort of expand that universe to also possibly include county transportation commissions who are in charge of most of the local bus and rail facilities. So I'll leave that with my very, very, very first broad question, and I know Andy may want to talk about this as well.
Maybe if we could just respond to that. So what you're talking about is analogous to this baseline discussion we're having, like how much, what were the assumptions in the SCS, and how do we know it goes beyond, and very aggressive targets there, maybe nothing goes beyond. And as one specific example and that we're familiar with is our Rule 2202, our rideshare rule. Like there are at least one city I know of that, took it upon themselves to go above and beyond. Santa Monica has gone well above and beyond any type of target. They don't care what we do with the rule anymore. They're on the path to reduce, to increase ride sharing, whether through a lot of different measures, whether it's their bike program or they're talking about Uber and other types of things to get people together. All these very complicated, intelligent transportation systems. Is that in the SCS entirely? Maybe some of it is, maybe some of it isn't. Those are the kind of things that, there's one example probably where they're probably beyond even what the SCS considered. But Rongsheng may know the details.
Thank you. Rongsheng or SCAQ. Yeah, in the SCS, a lot of the policies are more region-wide, so without very location-specific, so that complicates things. In addition, also what a model, not model, because it may have been captured in the 2016 RTP SCS, but every 4 years we do RTP update, so the policy, etc., do get updated. So how you account for this kind of above beyond can be complicated. Yeah, and but I also have one question related to this particular example.
If you could speak a little closer to the mic, I think it's still a little quiet.
Sorry, is that better? Yeah, and the question probably apply to this, also apply other measures. Let's say if there's some local ordinance that got adopted into the SIP, if in the future the local entity feels that they have to modify and change the ordinance, would I need to go through additional AQMD process in addition to the local revision process?
It would depend on where the enforceability is. So if, say, the district made the commitment to make up any shortfalls in a broader program, then the enforceability would be on us to make up that difference somehow. If it was set up such that the entity was willing to, in this example, it's really that opt-in rule. It's voluntary, but once you opt in, maybe it's not voluntary anymore. Then it could be enforceable on them, and they would have to go through it a bit. Even if that was the case, there would likely be provisions in there that if this changes, we need to figure out how to make up the difference. And so.
Right. Yeah, I just want to make sure that they're aware of this kind of additional possible requirements.
Dr. Andy Henderson, a couple of questions about this issue. One is, I know there was talk a minute ago about not looking too much into the baseline issues, but I think the SCS might be a little different in that it does go right into the RTP. And we had a discussion during the AQMP process where my understanding was that the regional transportation demand modeling that's done for the SCS is taken lock, stock, and barrel by the AQMD, and I believe goes right into the SIP baseline. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So given that, we also talked during that process about the fact that in taking these assumptions and putting them into the SIP effectively, that you're doing it on a district-wide basis and not disaggregating it back out to the cities or to localities. And so I'm a little confused because my understanding is it was a very, very sort of ambitious assumptions that are in there about VMT reduction and emissions reductions done at a district-wide basis. And I don't quite see how, well, I guess one question is, at what level is that enforceable? Is it only enforceable at the CARB level? Is it enforceable at the district level? Do we know that?
So you're asking about the existing SCS and sort of how that's enforceable. I think
The baseline related to the SCS.
I think that's always been
over time. How is that enforceable?
I think
because it doesn't have any of the integrity elements that we talked about for these new things might come along. And in fact, local government has a great flexibility to ignore the SCS and to continue to approve development irrespective of it. So who at what level is that enforceable?
this is interesting because what we're getting into is a very analogous situations to what we've been talking about in terms of facility-based measures and the regulatory role and how SCAG relates to their local jurisdictions and enforceability. You know, the SCS has some enforceability at the state level. The RTP has some enforceability at the federal level. We take it as the best assumption at the time of what's going to happen in the future. All we're talking about with this measure is if we do identify something that was above and beyond, and maybe you're right, maybe since it's all aggregate, we can't take credit for it because it may already just be making up for something that it's something we'd obviously have to work with SCAG on. So these are concepts and examples. These aren't proposals. We haven't worked out all the details, right?
Well, I guess that's sort of my second question. If you have a few cities like Santa Monica and Pasadena that are somehow bettering the SCS, but a greater number of cities are ignoring it, would EPA allow any kind of SIP credit for atomistic improvements done at a city-by-city basis, or would they look at whether or not the district as a whole is bettering the very ambitious assumptions in the SCS? And I would be surprised if it's the former, but maybe someone can
I mean, that's a valid point. If you're going to take credit, we need to see what's in baseline and see if it's, part of the aggregate assumption or beyond the aggregate assumption and what's happening going forward. But there's, again, as we've said before, it may not work. These concepts and ideas may end up not being enforceable, may not be surplus, may not be permanent. We're just putting out examples out here so we can all think through some of the issues we'll have to deal with if we're going to go in these directions, right? So those are great points. I don't think this changes that concept that the commitment is an aggregate and that there's no specific local accountability to meet SCS targets within the SCS process nor within the AQMP. This example would not change that.
So I think one of the things, this is actually a really good discussion. It's mostly saying what I was going to say on the next slide, that this particular example, I'll get to in a second. This particular example is, I think, one of the more challenging of the examples we've shown up here. One of the other things that's going to come up is the next cycle of the RTP is in 2020, right? Well, the first target is 2020 of 8%. And so it's going to be really interesting to see, well, what happens? Have we hit that 8% when we actually get to 2020 or not? And then what do we do? And what do we do for our own inventory? There's these commitments that it has to demonstrate, but so what happens when you actually hit that first target date and what happens next? And so that also ties into this. So it's the timing is one of the key challenges. And I think trying to figure out on the surplus side, it's the whole issue about these integrity elements. Each integrity element and every example is more important in one way or another. In this particular case, surplus is really a challenge, and then enforceability obviously too, but it's that surplus bit, this one is a tough bit. I'll get to
Rom Shenlo against SCAG. I just want to add that actually the RTP-SS is enforceable at the aggregate level because we have to meet all the emission budgets that's set in the SIP. So in that regard, we're held liable. If we cannot meet the budget, there will be consequences, but not to a very specific city jurisdiction level.
The state is responsible for the district meeting it at a district level. Is that correct?
Well, can you repeat the question?
The state is responsible for the emissions reductions in the SCS being achieved, or at least on a holistic basis, with all other emissions at a district level, at the South Coast district level. Is that correct?
Correct. Actually, probably more on the non-determined.
Rongxing's talking about the emissions budget in the RTP, which is enforceable federally through the transportation conformity laws.
Right, okay.
I was just going to say one other way, I think, in addition to looking at the inventory as an option, is that if CARB has already made this commitment, which it seems like since the beginning of your slides, that's what we discussed, then haven't we solved the enforceability problem because they're going to backstop all of this? Aren't they backstopping this? And we don't need to make all these individual programs enforceable so that they could, enforceable through EPA.
But in 2020, they will need to be either at CARB or at this level. So if we wait until December of
I'm not saying
2020 to
wait.
do it, then
I'm
yeah,
not saying
yeah,
wait.
yeah.
What I'm saying is CARB has already made the commitment in the air quality management plan. That commitment is going to be approved by EPA. So the
We hope.
enforceability hangs on CARB. So why are we trying to make all these individual programs enforceable when there already is a backstop, which is CARB, to get its own emission reductions? Why don't we allow these programs to be voluntary, and if they get the emission reductions, you've already got the backstop by CARB. I just think it's another option that we should look at in addition to the inventory option.
I think to me, the answer is that if we need 108 tons, for example, in 2023, do you want CARB regulations to be 108 tons of CARB regulation? Or do you want some other measures that can shave off that 108 that are measures that are proposed by local entities and have some other same enforceability for SIP creditability so that 108 can get shaved down through voluntary projects and programs that are already considered, already been committed to, or maybe are something that might want to be done that is crafted much more at the local level rather than CARB making the commitment on its own of a whole 108.
That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, just a minute, that's not what I'm saying though. You're twisting my words and I want to make sure it's clear.
Sorry.
What I'm saying is that when you're going to take SIP credit, there has to be some entity that EPA can enforce against. There has to be a backstop entity, right? Well, CARB is already making that commitment. You already have CARB as the backstop entity. So why not allow local programs to be more voluntary in nature, because you already have an entity that will commit to make up those emission reductions if they don't occur? Then you can allow more innovation. People could do more voluntary type of program because you already have an enforceable commitment. That's what I'm saying.
So I think the fundamental problem with that is that their current enforceable commitment is allowed. In 2020, their enforceable commitment is no longer allowed unless they can define and have all these other integrity elements included. So what the goal is to get some things in place to make it acceptable in the SIP by 2020. And if we don't, and CARB doesn't have an answer, and we don't have an answer, and nobody has an answer, that's a SIP gap, that's a SIP problem, it's unapprovable, and the sanction, and then the sanctions come, and the FIP comes, and all that. So we have to work towards, CARB has to work towards, we have to work towards, EPA hopefully has to work towards, in the remaining 3 years that we have, to figure out how to make whatever commitments are going to be made in 2020 acceptable within the SIP. They're acceptable today and they're acceptable through 2020. They're not acceptable after that. So that's when the bill comes due. And like I said, we don't want to wait till 2020 to scramble to fill that gap. That's just what this is about, is starting. And maybe at the end of the day, it's still all CARB's commitments to fill that gap in 2020. But at least it'll be acceptable in the SIP because a lot of these integrity elements would have been worked out.
If I could rephrase, I think, what Aileen's saying, we have an opportunity over the next 3 years, is the way I look at it, by the fact that CARB has taken up enforceability to be innovative and hopefully find what programs work and don't work without the risk of enforceability today, and come up with programs like VSR that will be successful. Those programs that are successful, maybe we formalize, maybe become enforceable, maybe, I don't know what happens in 2020, but that can happen in 2020. Today, we have the opportunity to be innovative between now and then to do exactly what you're suggesting, shave. And if we only look at programs that people accept as enforceable today, I'm concerned that we're not going to have much of a discussion. If everything has to be citizen enforceable here locally, I don't think we're going to be particularly successful. That's the first hurdle.
So I'm not disagreeing. That's absolutely what we're trying to do, is be creative right now to figure out what these things are, right? Our goal is to have, if everything's working, if everything's happening by 2020, if we have a pile of MOUs and agreements and rules that are all gonna be signed in 2020 to help fill that commitment, that's great. And we've done all the innovation before, we've seen what programs work, and then by that, we have to give, obviously, EPA some time to approve and all those things, but if the timing is a question. Obviously, we have to report back to our board if that's the approach we're all gonna take. But I keep saying, if there's gonna be 10 piles of MOUs or whatever it's gonna be, or rule adoptions or whatever it's gonna be to make that 108 SIP creditable at the state, local, federal level, whatever, the work needs to start now to figure that stuff out. What are the integrity elements are gonna come due, right? So let's figure them out now.
And I think part of it is what we're trying to do over this next 3 years. It doesn't mean that if there's some program that wants to be tried, that immediately you have to slap some sort of enforceability on it today. I think what we're trying to do through this process is figure out what do these mechanisms look like? What are these sort of SIP integrity elements? How can that work? And how do we develop that toolbox on the AQMD side? Is that through various rules? Is that through MOU structures that are simple for folks to adopt and figure out how it works? Let's figure out sort of that toolbox right now. It doesn't mean you have to slap it on right now, but by 2020, we're going to have all those in place, right? So I think that gets to what you're talking about. You've been waiting a while.
Lacey Buckingham. So if AQMD created a voluntary mobile source rule that incentivized the early deployment of low NOx natural gas vehicles using renewable natural gas, would that be where cities or counties or a port or airport could opt in to take credit for those early retirement of vehicles? Would that be something we're talking about here?
Done through a rule, it could be done how it's done now. There's many mechanisms that we can get the credit for those incentive programs, right? We've taken credit for Carl Moyer in the past. We hope to in the future. We hope to get more money. 1B projects have been taken credit for. School bus projects have been taken credit for. Whether it's a rule or not is an open question. Most of those are done contractually. We track the contracts. We know
but
how
if
many.
You're not giving money to someone, so like if they're buying vehicles on their own and they opt to buy low NOx natural gas vehicles that are using renewable natural gas, that's an opportunity if you had an agreement with the city, let's say, to take credit for that purchase.
Yes.
Instead of where you're giving money, like.
So that some of that could happen, for example, through fleet rules, if it's with the local government.
An optional fleet rule.
But I think even getting to the point that you're going to of what if it's private, right? If it's a private fleet that doesn't have that would be outside of our fleet rule authority currently, there could be credit generation kinds of rules as one possibility that could get there, but that's probably not the only mechanism. But that's one possibility.
Can I ask, does it matter why credit goes to a city? I mean, we're really just talking about credit going to the district, right? I mean, is there any benefit to saying the city gets the credit for the SIP reduction?
Only in that, for example, we have fleet rules that can apply to cities, or there are certain requirements there. So if there's some other requirement that's on a city already, they might want to be able to take credit for it, but it doesn't have to go that way.
One idea that's come up in some of the private discussions we've had with you and gets to what Thomas is saying is the concept of credits, right? So we have credit rules now, and where you can generate mobile source emission reduction credits by taking certain actions. And the concept of why we have them now is it's a different concept than SIP creditability. You're creating a credit that can be used in other programs, like in 2202 or other programs, to satisfy your rule obligations or compliance obligations. But you can envision a world where all we're talking about, all these elements, integrity elements, are all built in to rules or programs that if an entity does A through Z, they generate a credit, let's say. Not necessarily for the purpose of trading, but for the purpose of retiring it, giving it to EPA for SIP credit, right? The work would have to go into such a program to do that is immense. We need to start yesterday. Maybe you just whatever you've generated, your pile, instead of 200 MOUs that need to be signed. They're already signed and there's no enforceability until 2020 when all the credits you've generated for the year 2023 get submitted, and that immediately takes off. So that's a way maybe forward where we can just establish all the procedures, how we're going to satisfy all these things eventually, and as things go forward, we generate real emission reductions that we call quote credits. Not that you're going to trade them with each other necessarily or use them in other programs, but you're generating emission reductions that meet all these elements, and then at some point they can all be retired and you get SIP credit for it. So that's a concept that's come up in some of the discussions. I don't know if it's essentially the same thing, but this could be some advantages to structuring it that way.
Is what's driving your need to do this right now, this 2023 timeframe?
2020.
The
2020.
2020 is when we have to have specific measures for emission reductions that need to occur by 2023.
Isn't this 2020 though and 2023 deadline based on the revoked 2008 ozone standard?
Yes, but we still have obligations to meet that
isn't
standard under
but
the.
I thought the only obligation was that you don't backslide. So,
And
having
part of not backsliding is achieving your committed to emission reductions. So in essence, it's still in effect.
But I don't know about the, non 182, your comment about that, because I don't see that in the guidance. I mean, the only thing I've seen in the guidance is that you can't backslide.
And I
If
thought
you look at
also
the
that contingency-
anti-backsliding rule,
I looked at the
EPA comes out with it lists for a whole list of things that
Right.
you still in place, and one of them is emission reduction commitments.
Right, I
Well,
understand
but,
that.
But I thought it was contingency measures would still be activated.
That's
So if there
also
are
true.
existing contingency
That's
measures,
another
they would
thing
be
that doesn't
activated.
go
But
away.
beyond that, I don't know.
I was only raising the issue because, not to derail this, but just to say, we just should try to give enough time so that voluntary measures can have a chance to work, because people have a lot of good ideas, but I think when we're pushing the envelope, the time, and we have this big thing about the enforceability over us, it really stifles a lot of the innovation and the good ideas. That's all.
So I hope everyone understands that this working group is about is looking for those voluntary actions rather than rulemaking to go forward and get these emission reductions. And the goal is reductions, but the goal is SIP creditability. And we could disagree whether that's the primary goal or not. But when it comes to sanctions for the region, when it comes to FIPS, when it comes to what the alternative looks like, that's the issue we're trying to address. And for better or worse, SIP credit has the word enforceability in it, and we're trying to be creative with how that works. We can't, and we have a year to come up with some concepts that our board would judge are promising enough to move forward with in the future in this vein. And if we don't, the direction from our board has been you're going to pivot to indirect source rulemaking. So this is about being creative and coming up with those ideas. And I don't want the conversation to be stifled. We're talking about enforceability today because everyone wants to know how to get SIP credit for these measures. So enforceability is part of that. It's not what our entire focus of. We want the innovation to happen. We want people to get creative. But at the end of the day, it does have to be SIP creditable, or then we're not really achieving the goals we set out to achieve.
I think the other piece on this is that what we're trying to lay out here is that there's a lot of different potential mechanisms, and we know folks are worried about enforceability, but we're willing to try to work within the framework that we have, right, within the structure that we have, to try to find different ways to get there. And so on the enforceability piece, hopefully that's not going to hold folks up from trying some interesting ideas, and let's talk about it. Let's sit down. We can talk about it here or in other formats that we can start getting to some of those creative ideas, because ultimately that's where we need to go. And then we can, once we have specific ideas, I think what we're thinking is, well, let us noodle a little bit about how to get it SIP creditable. Here's some of the things that we're thinking about right now, but if people have good ideas, we need to start going through those. And now is the time to start going through ideas. It doesn't have to be fully baked, but let's start talking about it and let's start going through that, because come March, that's when we're reporting back to our board.
And I don't want to get caught up in semantics too much. So, when we say rule, we have many rules that are 100% voluntary. We have credit rules. Nobody's required to generate credits in a credit rule. It's just a structure. When we say something's voluntary, we can still have very enforceable SIP emission reductions that are voluntary because it's an opt-in, right? No one's forcing you to do it, but once you're willing to make the commitment, then it becomes enforceable at some level. So we're still talking about voluntary measures at this point. I don't know where we'll be a year from now, but right now we're still talking about voluntary measures.
Doctor, for the 2020 demonstration period, is it the 2016 baseline, or the baseline that was developed in 2016 that'll be applied at that time?
Yes, all the modeling was redone in 2016. That sets a new baseline, sets a new targets. Everything gets reset with that AQMP, 2016 AQMP.
And there's probably then projections about fleet mix and fuel mix in
Yes.
there. So it seems to me, given the kind of amazingly gigantic nature of the lift we've got here, that the only way to make any kind of dent in it is with radical change in fleet and fuels, because you're not in either that or wipe out half the population, one or the other. So if we should be looking at fleet and fuel change, then should we be looking at ways to demonstrate positive direction from the 2016 projections of fleet and fuel mix as being one very likely thing we should be looking at hardest?
So you're talking about fuel mix like CNG versus diesel versus gasoline? Is that what you're... So
hydrogen and electric and everything else.
So it's mostly going to be, if you're talking about making a dent, right, it's going to be on the heavy duty sector or the goods movement sector. Like the projections for how much the light duty sector is actually going to impact 2023 emissions, the NOx emissions, 7 or 8 tons a day, I believe. It's pretty small. So if we're talking about a big dent, we're talking about heavy duty or trucking. We are technology neutral there. We don't care what fuel it is, as long as emissions are lower and meet either new or what's currently voluntary standards set by the state. Let's see here. Light duty.
So the light duty is mixed in with the SUVs and all that. It's that lightest green there, so it's 25 tons or something like that. That's
but if you break it out into cars, it's
cars
pretty
is a
small
part.
So in terms of fuel switch, we're pretty agnostic and fuel neutral. We're just trying to get tailpipe emissions down across the board, and mostly on the heavier duty.
Well, there's two ways to do it: tailpipe emissions and VMT, and the VMT projections for the district show basically flat VMT in a fast-growing population over the next 25 years. Which probably won't happen. So I think we need to look more at the tailpipe emissions.
Yeah, we are.
In all sectors.
We are. I've said this before, that the road to attainment isn't paved by VMT reductions. Like you get a 5 or 8% improvement, you're jumping for joy. You get a new technology on a tailpipe, you get 90% improvement. That's where we tend to focus.
Right.
I have another one.
Yep.
On your list here, I know you have aircraft, and I see a number of airport folks, and I'm not going to call out and embarrass my friends from FAA, but they're here. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay. In terms of aircraft, I know that the motion that we were gathered here for, actually excluded aircraft, but if the goal stated today is about, attainment in the 2020 and the 2023, I don't know how you're going to move forward, and maybe when we get to an airport specific conversation we can do that, but how are you thinking about the aircraft issue, because that is a large part of the emissions for that sector?
Understood. And that's not tailpipe quote tailpipe emissions from a aircraft, NOx is not something that we're going to have a lot of influence over, and would be very difficult. I think when we're talking about, well, the non-aircraft, it's a subject of a working group, facility-based measure. We'll talk about all the other sources at an airport. I think the only thing we could think about with aircraft are like efficiencies and making sure that they're not, idling as much, or there's some things that might be done there that don't just benefit air quality, also benefit, on time arrivals and things. And airports are thinking about that all the time. So if an airport expands or makes a change that makes it much more efficient, there's less taxiing, less idling, maybe we can get some NOx credit for that because the aircraft's not there as long, right? So we could look at things like that.
Yep.
So Chris Shimoda, California Trucking Association. So just to kind of clarify what is in the further deployment bars, in future versions that you guys publish of this, could you actually break it down by what is in the SIP that was submitted to EPA, as far as where the further deployment tons are coming from in the SIP?
There's not specific allocations to specific actions, but what CARB listed 4 additional rules and regulations when the technologies allow them to be cost effectively deployed: intelligent transportation systems, operational efficiencies, and incentives. And we've added to that local measures. So there's really 5 areas that people are working on to help fill that box.
So to clarify, the source categories where the tons are coming from.
So there is some breakdown in there about ocean-going vessels versus heavy-duty sector. There are some breakdowns there, but it's very large. I mean, we could, 30 tons here, 40 tons there, 20 tons there. If you want, we could throw that in there. I think the concept behind this slide wasn't trying to get at that, but yeah, there is some of that in there.
So I think it'd be helpful to realize that, obviously, we're trying to do our fair share here. Most of the real reductions in the baseline are from existing truck rules, but the further deployment commitment for heavy duty is actually fairly small in 2031, and I just want that to be reflected.
And one of the reasons that's small is because the anticipation of a standard being set by CARB in the 2023 timeframe for new trucks, and then those will have so much greater penetration, so there's no need to put it in that further deployment because it's part of a specific measure that they've committed to. A lot by 2023, which is why it's larger there.
And so those tons taken should actually be reflected in, I think, that 23 ton controlled bar.
It will still be part of the 88
there,
and
it's not in the
108,
further
but
deployment.
it's broken. There are some tables that are broken out. We just didn't show it here. Okay.
That's the best estimate at this point that CARB put out. Obviously, if specifics come up, you could shift between different categories.
Okay. We'll go back through. We'll just have a couple more slides. I think we've talked a lot about the SES. I think we can probably go on from that SES. Just a different kind of example here on slide 26, the World Logistics Center. There was a settlement agreement between AQMD and the developer of that project as part of a CEQA lawsuit. The reason we bring this up is that this is just a different kind of mechanism. We wouldn't say that this is the preferred route for all projects moving forward, but this is something that's on the books that's an existing commitment. What's one part of this commitment is that there is a air quality fund essentially that will have to be established, that as that project is built out, there will be a fee that is paid on a square footage basis to an AQMD administered air quality fund. That fund would, upon full build out, be about $26 million that we would then use to incentivize cleaner vehicles, right? And so then, much like a Carl Moyer style program, there's an existing pot of money then that can get emission reductions from that. Thinking about how this looks, that's again a sort of a direct relationship. The local government doesn't have to be a part of this one necessarily, as far as the funding piece of it. When we look at this as far as, kind of the key things to take out of it, it is surplus and that it would be, extra emission reductions. It's we can use regular guidelines for make sure it's quantifiable. The one of the challenges though is, not knowing exactly what the timing of build out is going to be for this. There's some assumptions that are in there on the EIR. There's various activities that are going on, obviously, to try to make that project happen from the developer standpoint. But then how do we make sure we can get a certain amount of credit in attainment years? How much money is going to be in that fund in 2023, and how much will have been spent by AQMD by that time? And if we're thinking about prospective credit, how do we deal with that? So that's just one of the unique challenges in this sort of arrangement. It's nice in that there is this dedicated fund that's there. It's all settled. It's an existing commitment. But how do you get credit in a certain year? That's something that will be a challenge as we think about moving forward on this piece.
Just one question. This is Peter Herzog with NAP. You mentioned here under quantifiable that the emissions must be quantified, and then of course then there's the business by record keeping and tracking. Since this would be a fund created and administered by the AQMD, would the AQMD do all the quantification, record keeping, and tracking?
Yeah.
Gail Shiamoto, Laura again. I did have a question as to, this is an existing settlement agreement that's already been signed off by the respective parties.
Yes.
And as part of that, you have the implementation of a fee program. Question one is, to make this SIP creditable, does the existing settlement agreement have to be reopened to incorporate certain elements that are required by the integrity elements, or is it left and really what you are focusing on is the enforceability of the fee program, which is an implementation aspect of the settlement agreement? So I guess I'm asking is it the settlement agreement that is the mechanism, or is it the fee program that is the mechanism, or a combination of both? And just trying to understand it again with respect to my earlier question about, what do you do with existing agreements that have already been established and signed off by all parties?
This may be, my view is this may be an example where it may not be, this may serve. It's essentially collecting fees to put into programs that we already have, that now, or with some modifications, by the time we would start collecting this money, should have met all the integrity elements. Mm-hmm. The only thing we'd have to ensure is that, we have the ability to make sure that our agreement with the entity is enforceable, which it is, it's a settlement agreement, and that, we have reasonable expectation that this money would be flowing in.
I imagine we might have to do our own board resolution to sort of get that SIP creditability piece, right? What our commitment actually is from the districts on which timeframes. That might have to be a layer on top, but I don't think we'd necessarily have to open up.
That's actually true of everything we do here. In order to get SIP credit, we will have to, for any of this stuff, has to go through our board and get board adoption and a commitment to achieve those reductions. So that goes without saying. But this one is a little simpler because it's just the fee, it's just the money, and we know how to make that SIP creditable, or we think we do. Well,
right. Okay. For the last example here, moving on to airports, we wanted to take a look at LAX as an alternative fuel policy that's already on the books, and it has some timelines for compliance in it already. They're revisiting this policy right now and going to be updating it. It applies to on-road vehicles above 8,500 pounds. If you want some details on the existing policy, you can go to those links there. It's separate from our own fleet rules. We have Rule 1194, which applies to passenger transportation. This alt fuel agreement kind of goes above and beyond on that. And so the idea being that this would be similar to an example we talked about before. One thing that could happen, and an example is that, again, there's an MOU relationship between ourselves and the local government, being the airport, and that they have their own contracts and permit relationships with the entities that are actually using those vehicles. So when we get to the integrity elements, again, we need to show that this is above and beyond what's already in Rule 1194. And that one of the challenges with this sort of program too, though, is that there are alt fuel vehicles that are already assumed a little bit in the baseline. And so how do we know that these are not already captured in the baselines, that there is surplus reductions here? And so there's ways to maybe do that, but that would be a challenge with this kind of measure. Again, the quantification, it's, we can go through the bits that would need to be quantified. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that's particularly important on this one. I think we've covered all these bits already. Yeah. So I'm going to stop here before we get to the very last slide, just on these examples. We've had a lot of really good discussion so far. Are there other thoughts or questions, or, kind of thinking about these SIP creditable examples? Are the things that we want to talk about right now before we get on to next steps? For anybody on the phone, I don't know if anybody on the phone has any questions. Now's a good time. Hearing none. Okay.
Ian?
Yes.
Ian, Brian Hickson, Highland Fairview. I have all kinds of thoughts going through my head. I don't know if I can make a sensible question or two out of it. But going back to the example of the World Logistics Center, if I could just for a second, the link between the district and the business, to get across that link would be like an MOU or some sort of litigation that gets to a settlement agreement. That's the only two scenarios I can really think of.
Or contract, right? You can have some sort of contractual relationship, but if you're talking about bridging this triangle, I mean, you have these voluntary incentive programs, right?
So what brings somebody to the table on a contract or an MOU? A developer? What? Just well, exactly.
It could be in exchange for incentive funding. We may make it required to accept incentive funding that you're going to provide us with all this data and tracking that we need to get SIP credit, right?
I see. Okay.
So,
okay. Yeah.
I think the other piece that we haven't walked through in all of these examples that we can maybe go through at a future time, but is CEQA, right? CEQA is this other tool that's existing, that's out there, and there are a whole variety of reasons why people want to do things in CEQA documents and make various commitments. And if there's ways to use that as an opportunity, there might be some opportunities to do that there. The one challenge on CEQA documents, it's scale. I mean, there's a lot of work and substantiation and documentation to go through this exercise on any one of these examples, and on a small scale project, it might not be worth it, right? So it's of sufficient scale to do it. But CEQA can, especially on like a general plan, specific plan scale, there might be some opportunities there.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So thinking about next steps, we're obviously going to be continuing to work on all of this that we've been talking about right now. We definitely want to continue having meetings with stakeholders, getting to one of the points we heard earlier, that there might be some good creative ideas that are out there, that people want to take, voluntary measures on their own. We need to start talking about that.
Drew Delaney from Associates Environmental. Going back to the CEQA thing and developing voluntary rules through the AQMD, CEQA sometimes requires you to do every possible mitigation measure possible. If a voluntary measure goes on the rules, would that not be part of the mandatory mitigation automatically?
It's a good question. I think the requirement in CEQA is for feasible mitigation. And so I don't know if our rule would say that something is feasible. That's usually made on a project by project basis, although there will be those that would argue, well, if this other project found it was feasible, why can't you find it feasible? And that's out there already with CEQA, right? So I don't know that this necessarily changes that dynamic or changes that equation at all when it comes to CEQA. It just provides an extra mechanism to make sure we get SIP credit if something's done there. I think that's what we're thinking right now. So in any case, I think it's, what we're looking to do is, on these ideas that are out there, creative ideas, we need to start, hearing about what those are, or brainstorming with staff on this, and, give us a call, shoot us an email. We can sit down and meet with you, calls, whatever it is. We need to start going through this and going through it pretty quickly as far as what's out there, what are the possibilities out there, because if we go through this process and we find out after 6 months from now that we found at most a quarter ton from this process, that's all we've heard that folks want to do on a voluntary collaborative basis, that's, you know, that's what all we have that we present to our board, and that's something we're going to have to consider about what our path is moving forward. We'd rather try to see what are the projects that are out there that might have a voluntary a component to it, and I think we're really interested in seeing that. So one of the things we've heard a lot about is on the baseline. We definitely are going to be continuing to work internally on the baseline, making sure, you know, we have a solid understanding on what are the assumptions and how does it apply to each facility based measure. That really is critical, and so we're trying to make sure that, you know, we have a broad understanding for ourselves that when we have more of these individual conversations, we can get into those levels of detail.
On that point, Ian, though, we need to look at the baseline, but the baseline is now more or less etched in stone because it was established last year. Is that right?
And we can maybe, I mean, one of the things we can maybe do is if there's some key assumptions that are in the baseline that we think are worth putting out there, we can also maybe post it on the website that are key ones that are broad-based. And when it gets into the level of detail that we're probably going to need, it's going to be hard to compile all that on a website. But some of the broad-based ones, we can maybe put that on there. So. I mean, in some respects, that, you know, what the website has right now, as far as existing regulations, that's all baked in the baseline already. You can assume that all the requirements from existing regulations that's all there, but the details are really going to matter, right? And then thinking about for our next meeting, so we will just so. As a reminder of what our process is, we are going back to the governing board in March, which means we'll probably be going to our mobile source committee in February, but we also have a commitment to go to our mobile source committee in October. So we thought one more meeting before we get back to that progress report in October to our mobile source committee, sometime mid-late September. We're tentatively shooting for September 21st right now. We're still working on what that agenda might be, but I think a lot of that is what are the conversations we have with you all one-on-one or in, you know, stakeholder groups or what have you. Until then, we're working towards that goal next. So, and with that, I think that's it for today. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.